This is for you, my shining light. May it make your journey a little happier." Gorgathul the Eviscerated had not always been called that. Once, in the brief and optimistic period before his first defeat, he had been known simply as Gerald. Then came the adventurers, the dramatic renaming, the skull throne, the lava moat decorative, largely non-functional, and 437 years of being ritually humiliated in front of his own minions. The name Gerald, he reflected, had possessed a certain dignity. You did not get Gerald the Eviscerated. Gerald was the sort of name that belonged on a tax return, not a prophecy. He was currently sitting at his obsidian desk, hewn from the living rock of Mount Scorath by enslaved dwarves who had, now that he thought about it, probably unionized by now, staring at the quarterly report. The quarterly report said what the quarterly report always said: hero incursions, 14. Boss defeats, 14. Minions slain, several thousand. Treasury losses, significant. Strategic objectives achieved, pending review. Pending review, Gorgathul said aloud to no one in particular. His familiar, a large raven named Despair, tilted its head at him from the perch by the window. Outside, somewhere in the dungeon's lower corridors, he could hear the distant clatter of adventurers looting the break room. They had been at it since Tuesday. He had tried this time. He genuinely had. He'd restructured the guard rotation. He'd invested in better lighting, torches placed at shorter intervals, no more suspiciously dark alcoves that screamed ambush to anyone who'd ever played a board game. He'd hired a consultant, a young lick named Praxis who had an MBA and wore glasses despite not having eyes, and Praxis had recommended leaning into the brand and optimizing the dungeon's unique value proposition. Gorgathul had asked what that meant. Praxis had said it meant making the dungeon scarier. Gorgathul had pointed out that the dungeon already contained, among other things, a room full of screaming faces and a pit that whispered. Praxis had suggested mood lighting and a logo refresh. Gorgathul had paid him in cursed gold, which was the only kind he had, and Praxis had left swearing in 3 dead languages. The heroes, meanwhile, had arrived with a paladin. They always arrived with a paladin. This particular paladin was named Brindis the Resolute, and she had already, according to his remaining minions' reports, given an inspiring speech in the entrance hall, healed 2 of her companions from near death, and defeated his floor 7 guardian, a 30-foot-tall iron colossus that had taken Gorgathul 60 years to construct, in approximately 11 minutes. 11. He timed it himself, sitting in his viewing chamber eating a bowl of despair, the soup, not the raven, and watching through his seeing stone with the hollow expression of a man who has been through this before. He was 462 years old. He had started this career with genuine ambition. He had wanted to conquer the realm, obviously. That was baseline, that was the entry-level aspiration. Everyone had that one, but beyond that he had possessed, if you could believe it, real vision. An empire of shadows stretching from the Thornwood to the Saltmere coast, a new age of darkness. The sun blotted out by his command, the peoples of the known world bending the knee, the crops failing in a suitably symbolic fashion. He'd drawn diagrams. None of the diagrams had mentioned the paperwork. Nobody told you about the paperwork. Nobody stood in the ruins of your predecessor's lair and said, "By the way, when you're an ancient evil, you'll spend approximately 60% of your time on administrative tasks." There were payroll documents for minions, categorized by type, which was complicated when you employed both skeletons and goblins, and they had different union agreements regarding hazard pay. There were the procurement orders for torture implements, which had to go through 3 separate approval processes since the incident where someone had accidentally ordered 900 thumbscrews when the original request was for 90, and they'd had no storage space for them and had eventually been forced to use them as filing dividers, which was both wasteful and vaguely on brand. There were the quarterly reports. Always the quarterly reports. The adventurers had reached floor 9. He knew this because his minion alarm system, a series of enchanted gongs that were supposed to provide real-time location updates, had all gone silent in sequence, which was its own kind of report, really. A very expensive, very quiet report, Gorgathul opened his desk drawer and removed a folder. It was not a folder of evil plans. It was a folder of prospectuses. He had been collecting them for 6 months, with the careful secrecy of a man who suspects that what he is doing is embarrassing. There was one from the Aldenmere Institute of Commerce, which offered a correspondence course in intermediate accounting. There was one from the Merchants Guild of Vethara, advertising positions for detail-oriented professionals with strong organizational skills. There was, and he was not proud of this, a pamphlet from a well-being retreat in the Eastern Hills that promised gentle reintegration for those leaving high-stress positions. He was not going to the retreat. He was absolutely not going to the retreat. He had merely kept the pamphlet because the mountains in the photograph were quite nice, actually, and sometimes a person who had spent 4 centuries in a lightless dungeon beneath a volcanic peak simply wanted to look at a picture of mountains with the sun on them and not feel guilty about it. And if despair ever mentioned it to anyone, he would have the raven stuffed. The door to his throne room opened. He swept the folder under the desk with the speed of a man with something to hide, which he was. It was Scrix, his head minion. Scrix was a goblin of advancing years and advancing cynicism, and the primary reason Gorgathul still had any functioning dungeon at all, because Scrix was the only minion who did not panic in a crisis, largely because Scrix had concluded decades ago that panic was a waste of energy when catastrophe was functionally inevitable. He had the expression of someone who had come to deliver news that was not news, because it was the same news as always. "They are in the antechamber," said Scrix. "I know," said Gorgathul. "Paladin did the thing with the light. Floor 8 Guardian's gone." "I know. Floor 7 Guardian was faster than usual. 11 minutes. 10 minutes and 43 seconds, said Gorgathul with the precision of a man who had been counting. Scrix sat down on a small chair without being invited, which was something he had been doing for roughly 200 years, and which Gorgathul had long since stopped objecting to. "You want me to send in the reserve cultists? No, spectral wolves. No, they are still the trapped corridor on the east side. If we recalibrate the Scrix," Gorgathul looked at him. "When did we last win?" Scrix considered this with the careful seriousness it deserved. "There was the incident in the 3rd century where the heroes got trapped in the puzzle room and went home. They didn't leave because we won. They left because Aldrich the Unbroken twisted his ankle on a loose flagstone and they couldn't carry him through the boss chamber on account of the spiked traps. Technically," said Scrix, "they didn't reach you. That's not winning. That's a slip-and-fall claim." Gorgathul leaned back in his throne, which was uncomfortable, because throne design prioritized menace over lumbar support, and he had been meaning to do something about that for decades. "We haven't won, Scrix. We've lost 437 consecutive encounters with adventuring parties. 437. The last time I checked, a professional record of 0 wins and 437 losses would, in any other field, result in dismissal. You can't dismiss yourself," Scrix pointed out. "Perhaps that's the problem." There was a pause. In the antechamber, something exploded. They both glanced at the door and then back at each other with the air of people who had decided not to investigate. "Been thinking," said Gorgathul. "Oh," said Scrix, in a tone that contained an entire paragraph of concern. "Been thinking that perhaps this isn't the right role for me." Scrix was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone, the bard, from the sound of it, was performing what appeared to be an inspirational song. The acoustics of the dungeon carried it beautifully. It had a very catchy chorus. Gorgathul hated that he knew the words by this point. "The ancient evil," said Scrix carefully. "It's not really a role. It's more of a condition. It though? Or is it a career path I chose at an impressionable age because I was good at being frightening and didn't think through the long-term satisfaction metrics?" Gorgathul opened the desk drawer again, removed the folder and placed it on the desk with the decisive energy of someone who has decided to stop being embarrassed. "I've been looking at alternatives." Scrix looked at the folder. He looked at Gorgathul. He looked at the folder again. "Is that a prospectus from the Aldenmere Institute of Commerce? Intermediate accounting. Yes. You want to do accounting. I want to do something where, at the end of the working day, the thing I was working on is still there." Gorgathul spread his hands, a gesture that encompassed the throne room, the dungeon, 4 centuries of investment, and the distant, ongoing sound of his infrastructure being systematically destroyed. Everything I build, they take apart. Everything I summon, they banish. Every plan I make, they foil. A ledger scricks. A properly maintained ledger doesn't get foiled by a paladin. Paladins can audit you, said Scrix, but he said it quietly because he could hear that this had moved past the stage of idle complaining. I'm good with numbers, Gorgathul continued. I always have been. Do you know how much logistical planning goes into running a dungeon of this size? The resource allocation, the staffing ratios, the cost-benefit analysis of each trap, factoring in maintenance, reset costs, and probability of hero-type encounter. He had stood up without quite meaning to. I've been doing de facto financial management for 400 years. I just haven't had the qualification. Scrix was quiet for what felt like a respectful period of time. What about the prophecy? What about it? He shall rise in darkness, and his shadow shall cover the realm. That prophecy. The one carved above the entrance. The one they quote every time they come in. Gorgathul sat back down. The prophecy. Yes, the prophecy was a complication. He'd had it commissioned at the start of his tenure, cost a fortune, very reputable oracle, lovely stonework, and it had seemed at the time like a sound investment in long-term brand identity. He had not considered that it would become something of an obligation. Every adventuring party that rocked up to the dungeon gates had already read the prophecy and come preloaded with the knowledge that their quest was cosmically mandated, that they were the chosen ones, that darkness would be vanquished and light restored and the realm would be free. The prophecy, in retrospect, was doing a remarkable amount of work to undermine him from the very entrance. Prophecy, he said, is not legally binding. Prophecy Oversight Council might disagree. Prophecy Oversight Council can take it up with my solicitor. He paused. Do I have a solicitor? You have a cursed advocate, technically. He's trapped in a gem in the treasury. Right. Well, he can write the letters. Gorgathul straightened his robes, which were magnificent and deeply impractical, and had always been slightly too long in the left sleeve, a tailoring error he'd been meaning to correct for a century and a half. The point is, I've made a decision. Doors of the throne room burst open with the traditional dramatic force of doors that had been built specifically to be burst open dramatically. Light flooded in, actual divine light, bright and warm and smelling faintly of righteousness, and there they were. The adventurers. 5 of them, as per industry standard. The paladin at the front, armor gleaming, sword raised, expression radiant with purpose. Behind her, a ranger, a wizard, a rogue who was still pocketing things from the corridor outside, and the bard who was, yes, still performing. Gorgathul the Eviscerated, cried Brindis the Resolute with the particular energy of someone who had prepared this line. Your reign of darkness ends today, the light of— Yes, yes, said Gorgathul. He had not stood up. Brindis faltered. They always delivered the speech to someone standing. It was significantly harder to deliver an impassioned declaration of righteous combat to someone who was sitting down looking tired. You, the light of the new dawn, Gorgathul continued helpfully, etc. The realm shall be free, the darkness is vanquished, you can skip to the fight if you like, I don't have strong feelings about it. He glanced at Scrix. I've actually got somewhere to be. Somewhere to be, Brindis repeated. She looked at her companions. The wizard shrugged. The ranger appeared to be reading the prophecy inscription, which she had apparently only just noticed. Submitted an application, said Gorgathul, to the Aldenmere Institute. The correspondence course is self-paced, which is genuinely useful given my schedule, or rather given the schedule I used to have, which was also self-paced in a different and significantly more oppressive direction. The first module covers double-entry bookkeeping. Double-entry bookkeeping, said the wizard. He was a small man with large spectacles and the specific expression of someone who did not sign up for this. Principle that every financial transaction affects 2 accounts simultaneously. It's elegant, actually. There's a kind of symmetry to it. Assets equal liabilities plus equity. Everything balances. Gorgathul looked at his desk, at the quarterly report with its column of losses and its pending review, and felt something he hadn't felt in quite some time, which was interest. Chaos, he continued, does not balance. I've been in the chaos business for 4 centuries, and I can tell you with professional certainty that it is entirely non-fungible, extremely difficult to audit, and the depreciation schedule is a nightmare. There was a long pause. Are you, said Brindis slowly, resigning? I prefer pursuing a career transition, said Gorgathul. But yes, functionally, Scrix will handle the handover. There are outstanding contracts with several shadow entities that will need resolving, and the spectral wolves' feeding schedule is in the left-hand drawer. Don't miss it. They get difficult, but the administrative documentation is largely in order. I always kept good records. It's the one thing I was genuinely good at that nobody valued. Rogue had stopped pocketing things and was starring openly. The bard had, for the first time in what Gorgathul estimated was approximately 9 dungeons worth of narrative, stopped performing. Even Despair the Raven was quiet, which was unusual, because Despair was normally a loud and opinionated raven. We can't, said Brindis. She seemed genuinely distressed, which Gorgathul found oddly a little touching. The prophecy is carved in stone and therefore immovable, I understand. But prophecies speak to the conclusion of the darkness, not the manner. If the darkness transitions into a well-organized sole proprietorship in the financial services sector, that still counts as concluded. Ask your cleric. He stood, finally, and the room did the thing it always did when he stood, which was to feel smaller. He was very tall. Centuries of dungeon dwelling had not touched that. Brindis, you've defeated me on 3 previous occasions. I believe you were called Brindis the Steadfast then, and before that Brindis of the Eastern March, and before that your name was actually something else, but the bards kept changing it for scansion reasons. 3 times. 3 times we've done this, and each time the darkness has returned. Has it occurred to any of you to ask why? Brindis had clearly not expected a philosophical question. She opened her mouth, closed it, and looked at the ranger, who had also not expected this and was now intently examining the floor. Because, said Gorgathul, the conditions that produce a dungeon boss are structural. I'm not the problem, I'm a symptom. Someone new will fill this vacancy within the decade, probably faster. There are several minor shadow entities who have been angling for the position. I've seen the correspondence. You'll be back. You'll always be back. Unless someone addresses the root causes, which nobody ever does, because it's significantly easier to stab the visible evil than it is to do the policy work. He picked up his folder of prospectuses. He said, with a quiet dignity that surprised even him, I'm doing the policy work, in the sense that I am removing myself from the cycle and attempting to become a productive member of commercial society. There was a very long silence. I don't suppose, said the bard in a small voice, you do an exit interview. I'm not going to do an exit interview. It's just that the guild records would really benefit from. I'm not doing an exit interview. Gorgathul nodded once to Scrix, who nodded back with the expression of a goblin who had seen everything and had now, genuinely, seen everything. He took his coat from the hook behind the throne. It was a very dramatic coat, black with silver trim, and it was going to look slightly incongruous in an accounting office, but he was keeping it because some standards had to be maintained. And he walked past the adventurers, who parted for him with the reflexive deference of people who have trained their bodies to make way for apex predators but whose minds haven't quite caught up with the current situation. At the door, he paused. Brindis. She turned. Very good at your job, he said. I mean that sincerely. The speech in the entrance hall was particularly well structured. Clear thesis, strong emotional through-line, appropriate use of divine authority without tipping into self-righteousness. If you're ever looking for a change yourself, I hear the Merchants Guild is recruiting. He looked at the bard. The song is still too loud in the chorus. He walked out of his dungeon for the first time in 4 centuries. The sun was, and he had known this intellectually because he had once briefly controlled the weather, very bright. He stood at the dungeon entrance for a moment, blinking in the particular way of someone whose eyes had adapted to firelight and soul darkness and the ambient glow of cursed treasures, and he thought, right then. Module 1, Debellentry Bookkeeping. Behind him he heard Brindis say, do we? And the wizard say, I genuinely don't know. And the rogue say, I mean I've looted the antechamber already. and Scrixay in the dry tone of someone taking attendance at a moderately important meeting. He's gone. Do you lot want the treasury? I can unlock it. It's just going to sit there otherwise. Gorgathul walked down the mountain. It took him most of the day because the mountain was very large and he had not, in 4 centuries, invested in appropriate footwear for outdoor terrain. His boots were excellent for standing on a raised dais in a throne room and extremely poor for negotiating loose shale. He slipped 3 times. Nobody witnessed this, which was a mercy. At the base of the mountain there was a village. The village was called Fenwick's Rest, and it had, he knew from his intelligence reports, a population of approximately 300, a decent market on Wednesdays, and a charter office that doubled as a postal depot where one could collect correspondence from institutions of higher learning. It also had, according to the pamphlet he had memorized entirely against his will, a branch of the Aldenmere Commercial Bank, which was looking for an experienced administrator to manage a minor portfolio of regional accounts. He was not going to walk into the bank on day 1. That was not how this worked. He was going to collect his study materials, find lodgings, and approach this with the same methodical rigor he had applied to dungeon management, except that this time the quarterly report would say something other than pending review. The village noticed him immediately. This was inevitable, given the coat. A small child pointed. An elderly woman who was sitting outside the baker's shop squinted at him with the careful assessment of someone who has seen a lot of things come down off that mountain and has opinions about all of them. A dog barked. He nodded politely to the dog, which was more than he had done for most of his minion corps, and the dog, apparently satisfied, stopped barking. The charter office was run by a man named Orville who had the specific energy of someone who processed a great deal of unusual correspondence and had decided at some point to stop asking questions about it. He handed Gorgathul 3 parcels from the Aldenmere Institute, the Module 1 materials, a welcome letter, and a complimentary calendar featuring illustrations of successful past graduates, without comment, which Gorgathul appreciated. "Lodgings," said Gorgathul. "Can you recommend somewhere?" "The inn at the crossroads does rooms," said Orville. "Tell Marta I sent you. She'll put you in the east wing. It's quieter." "Thank you. You're the dungeon boss, aren't you?" said Orville. "It was not quite a question." "I was," said Gorgathul. "I'm in career transition." Orville nodded with the philosophical equanimity of a man who processed mail for a living and had learned that other people's journeys were their own business. "Module 3's the tricky one," he said. "VAT returns." "Everybody struggles with VAT returns." Gorgathul stared at him. "You've done the Aldenmere course, completed it in the 3rd year after the big dungeon cleared out. Figured there'd be more commerce once the shadow lifted. I was right." Orville shrugged. "Module 3, don't let it beat you." Said Gorgathul with what he suspected was inappropriate fervor for a conversation about tax administration. "Will not." He found the inn. He found a room which was small and had a window that faced east and would, he realized with a peculiar internal sensation, catch the morning light. The bed was aggressively normal. There was a rag rug on the floor. On the wall, someone had hung a small embroidered piece that said "Home is where the hearth is," which was not a sentiment he had previously encountered outside of enemy villages he was burning, and which, in this context, meant something quite different. He sat down on the bed. He opened Module 1. The first page said, "Welcome to Intermediate Accounting, a foundation for financial clarity. This course will equip you with the tools to bring order, transparency, and balance to any commercial enterprise. Order, transparency, balance." Gorgathul the Eviscerated, Gerald, perhaps, eventually, if he could convince himself, read those 3 words and felt, for the first time in 462 years, something that was not bitterness, or exhaustion, or the low-grade existential despair of a creature whose entire professional identity had been built on losing. He felt, quietly and without any drama whatsoever, optimistic. Outside, very faintly from somewhere up the mountain, he could hear the distant sound of a bard's chorus echoing through the passes. He'd been right about the chorus. Far too loud. He turned the page. "Thanks for listening until the end. Please like and subscribe.